In the summer of 1889, a small photography studio stood on the edge of Yorkshire's moors. The sign above its wooden door read, "Ellery and Sons Portraiture." Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and silver nitrate, the scent of time being captured. That year, the Ellery family sat for what should have been an ordinary portrait. Father, mother, 2 children. The youngest held a lace doll. The eldest, Thomas, sat stiffly, his gaze slightly off from the lens. When the photograph was rediscovered nearly a century later, it seemed at first unremarkable. A standard cabinet portrait printed on albumen paper, dated 1889. But under the museum's restoration lamp, something subtle emerged. The boy's eyes, half-closed mid-blink, appeared alive. Not simply blurred, but caught in a motion that no camera of that era should have been able to record. The restorer, Margaret Ellison, documented her findings in 1974 while cataloguing Victorian portraits from an estate auction. She wrote, "There is something deeply unsettling about the boy's face. When viewed under different light, it feels as though he is on the verge of opening his eyes." Further comparison revealed an impossibility. Multiple prints developed from the same glass plate showed different states of his eyes, closed in one, open in another. Each print authenticated, each traceable to the original plate. Historians proposed chemical degradation, exposure error, or even deliberate retouching. Yet none explained how the same negative could yield prints that changed across decades. Ellison's notebook ended with a single line, circled twice. It was as if the boy refused to stay still. Even after death, photography was invented to freeze time, to hold a single instant forever. But this one seemed to have done the opposite, not preserving stillness but remembering motion. And so the question that haunted every curator since, can a single captured moment decide to keep moving? Victorian England was a culture fascinated and haunted, yes, by permanence. Photography had become more than an invention. It was a ritual. By the late 1800s, families gathered in studios not only to celebrate life, but to defy its loss. A portrait was believed to hold essence, memory, even spirit, a fragment of the person preserved beyond death. Death portraits, as they came to be known, were often taken after passing, as a way to keep presence within reach. Cameras were not merely tools. They were instruments of remembrance and perhaps superstition. In 1889, the coastal town of Whitby, North Yorkshire, stood at the crossroads of this obsession. Known for its shipyards and its haunting sea mists, Whitby had also become a haven for early photographers experimenting with the new dry plate emulsions, methods that allowed faster exposure and finer detail. Among these artisans was James Ellery, a modest portraitist whose family lived above his small studio near the harbour. Church and census records from that year list James, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children, Thomas, aged 12, and Clara, aged 7. In late November of 1889, the Ellery family sat for a portrait, their last together. Local parish documents record a tragedy only weeks later. Young Thomas succumbed to a sudden fever, described in the register as a wasting illness, unknown in origin. His death left the family in grief, and the portrait became their keepsake, passed quietly through the years that followed. When the photograph resurfaced generations later, through an estate auction tied to a surviving branch of the Ellery line, it was thought to be simply another Victorian relic. Yet what set it apart, what would puzzle restorers and historians for decades, was the strange illusion within the boy's face. At first, experts dismissed the phenomenon. Some blamed the degradation of the albumen print. Others suggested that repeated reprinting from the glass plate caused misalignment or micro-cracks that mimicked movement. But detailed spectrographic analysis revealed no such inconsistencies. The emulsion was intact. The plate had not been retouched. What remained was an uncomfortable fact. The photograph's chemistry was stable, but its expression was not. And so the question lingered, whispered between archivists, studied in silence by curators. How could a portrait, fixed more than a century ago, begin to display motion where none should ever exist? The mystery of the Ellery photograph truly began to unfold in 1974, inside the quiet restoration wing of the Whitby Museum of Local History. A young technician named Peter Collingwood, assigned to clean and digitize a series of Victorian family portraits, stumbled upon something that defied both logic and chemistry. Two identical photographs, both labeled Ellery Family 1889, sat side by side in the archival drawer. At first glance they appeared the same. A seated mother, a stoic father, a little girl holding a lace handkerchief, and the boy, Thomas Ellery, seated at the front. But under magnification, Collingwood noticed something impossible. In one print, Thomas's eyes were open, faintly glinting with light, a natural, almost living gaze. In the other, his eyelids appeared gently closed, as though mid-blink. He checked the museum logbook. Both prints originated from the same glass negative, taken by the same photographer, Edwin Hollis, on the same day. Yet they were not identical. The blink, that single human movement, should never have existed in two states within one exposure. Collingwood, bewildered, brought the matter to his supervisor, who in turn contacted Dr. Helena Brooks, a respected expert in early photographic science from the University of York. Dr. Brooks was known for her meticulous studies on dry plate emulsions and the quirks of Victorian exposure times. She agreed to investigate, expecting to find a simple explanation, perhaps chemical degradation or overlapping negatives during printing. But when she examined the glass plate under spectral light, she found no signs of tampering, double exposure, or re-etching. The emulsion was intact. The blink, disturbingly, was not a trick of preservation. It was part of the original capture. Then came a chilling discovery. Among Hollis's surviving notebooks, dated November 1889, Dr. Brooks found an entry written in neat ink. Attempted prolonged capture, 15 seconds. Subject restless, eyes flickered. It matched perfectly with the Ellery family's sitting. A 15-second exposure was standard for portraits of that period, but it was long enough to record small movements, a breath, a heartbeat, a blink. Yet the photographic chemistry should have blended those moments into blur. Instead, here was evidence of two distinct states. One boy with eyes open, another with eyes closed, both printed from the same negative. This finding sent ripples through photographic circles. Brooks published a short paper in the British Journal of Visual History, 1976, proposing a rare optical memory effect, where residual light impressions might form successive imprints on slow-reacting emulsions. Her theory was met with skepticism. Then came the letters. In 1912, decades earlier, the Ellery daughter Clara, by then an adult living in London, had written to a friend about her childhood memories. One passage stood out. After Thomas passed, Mother forbade the sitting room at dusk. She said she could hear his faint footsteps by the photo table, as though he never left the frame. The museum archivists dismissed it as grief's echo, a family's sorrow preserved in superstition. But to Brooks it felt unnervingly literal. By 1980, collectors and restoration experts across Europe began examining other late Victorian photographs for similar irregularities, searching for motion, distortion, or traces of what they called restless captures. Most found nothing, but a few unearthed faint shifts, a hand slightly altered in position, a mouth mid-word, an eye that seemed half alive. The Ellery photograph became an obsession not only for scientists, but also for artists and theologians. To some, it represented the boundary between motion and memory, a moment that refused to die. And beneath the analysis, one haunting idea grew stronger. Perhaps it wasn't the camera that caught Thomas Ellery's final movement. Perhaps it was Thomas who refused to be still. The trail that began with a blink led Dr. Helena Brooks deeper into the fog of Victorian experimentation than she ever expected. By the late 1980s, she had traced the photographer, Edwin Hollis, not merely as a craftsman of portraits, but as a man consumed by the philosophical promise of photography, that one might not only capture life but preserve its motion. In 1991, while visiting Whitby, Brooks learned that Hollis's old studio still stood, a small, rotting brick building tucked behind Baxter Street, its windows shuttered, its sign faintly legible under layers of dust, E. Hollis, Portraiture and Light Studies. The building had long been converted into a storage annex for the town's local archives. When the attic was finally opened for cataloguing, the air that escaped was thick with chemical dust, the ghost of silver nitrate and collodion. Inside were 3 large wooden crates labeled Hollis, equipment and records. What Brooks found inside would alter every assumption she had. There were notebooks, more than a dozen, meticulously written, each page filled with experimental observations. On the spine of one, in careful cursive, the words, "Sequential Exposure Method." The first few entries seemed routine, notes about lighting angles, subject positioning, and exposure length. But deeper in the pages, the tone changed. Hollis had begun writing in speculative language, closer to philosophy than science. "If a soul lingers through breath," one line read, "perhaps it may be persuaded to rest upon the plate." He described layering thin sheets of gelatin emulsion, allowing the chemical surface to retain memory of light across moments. His hypothesis: the emulsion could record movement across thought, a poetic phrase that blurred the boundary between experiment and seance. In another entry dated October 1889, just weeks before the Ellery sitting, Hollis wrote, "Test successful. Subject instructed to breathe gently upon the plate before capture. Residual warmth binds the spirit of presence. Not a trick of exposure. Something lives beneath." The language echoed the spiritualist practices. Then sweeping across Britain, the belief that photography could serve as a bridge between the living and the departed. Hollis, it seemed, had not merely been experimenting with light, but with the essence of life itself. Beside the notebooks sat a sealed box of undeveloped glass negatives, each marked with a handwritten code. When opened under controlled lab conditions in 1992, the chemical composition was found to match precisely the Ellery family plate, a unique mixture of silver nitrate, gelatin, and trace organic compounds, notably oily residues inconsistent with standard studio contamination. That same year, ultraviolet scanning technology had advanced enough to permit non-invasive imaging of Victorian negatives. When the Ellery plate was scanned under UV fluorescence, faint outlines appeared just beyond visible range, a secondary imprint, slightly offset, of Thomas Ellery's face. His mouth, his eyes, the contours of his cheek, all mirrored but shifted by a fraction of a second. To interpret this, Brooks sought the expertise of Dr. Peter Lang, a chemical imaging specialist at Cambridge University. Lang's microscopic analysis uncovered a startling anomaly: two distinct strata of silver nitrate crystals, separated by a thin film of organic residue. Not dust, Lang noted in his report. Organic oil consistent with human sebum or exhaled vapor, possibly the photographer's or subject's breath. He paused during an interview years later and added, almost reluctantly, "It's as if the emulsion captured something that was still alive in the air." The implications were unsettling. Shortly thereafter, Brooks uncovered a brittle clipping from the Whitby Gazette, dated January 3, 1890, barely a month after the Ellery portrait. The small notice read, "A local photographer, Mr. Hollis, has drawn curiosity with his experiments in motion capture of souls. He claims to have produced images wherein expression changes between sittings. A marvel or a mischief, the public shall judge." Hollis vanished from the historical record soon after. By 1892, his studio had closed. No obituary was ever printed, yet what his experiment suggested, and what the Ellery photograph proved, was extraordinary. Hollis may have stumbled upon a primitive form of motion recording, not mechanical but chemical, decades before moving pictures were born. But instead of capturing time through multiple frames, he had created something else, a hybrid image, half still, half living. When Brooks and Lang compared multiple prints of the Ellery portrait, a new and more disturbing pattern emerged. Each print, depending on who scanned or viewed it, appeared subtly altered. For one observer, Thomas's eyes seemed open wider. For another, his mouth carried the faintest trace of a smile. Brightness shifted. Shadows breathed. The changes were not random. They correlated faintly with the viewer's angle, sometimes even their emotional tone, a phenomenon Lang later described as observer interference. By 1993, the project took on an almost metaphysical dimension. The archivists began to whisper that the photograph looked back. Brooks herself admitted in a private letter to a colleague that she felt a sensation of being regarded from within the emulsion, as though the image perceives its witness. Her conclusion, cautiously worded in her final field notes, bridged both science and psychology. The Ellery plate does not merely record light, it responds to observation. Its state is not fixed. Each act of seeing reshapes it. The notion was staggering. If true, the photograph was not a static artifact but a living document of perception, altered by the consciousness that engages with it. And so, the line between chemistry and haunting, between science and superstition, blurred into one chilling hypothesis. The Ellery portrait did not simply contain a boy who once lived. It contained the ongoing act of being seen. By the early 2000s, the Ellery portrait had drifted once more into quiet obscurity, archived, digitized and sealed behind glass in a controlled storage room at the Whitby Museum. But in 2003, a team of imaging technicians from the University of York, tasked with converting the collection into high-resolution digital formats, stumbled upon something no one could have predicted. While performing a 2400 dpi scan of the original plate, one technician noticed what looked like a faint ridge pattern near the lower corner of the emulsion, so faint it was invisible to the naked eye. Under magnification, the markings formed a partial fingerprint embedded beneath the surface of the glass. At first, it was assumed to belong to Edwin Hollis, the photographer, but when researchers compared the ridge alignment against prints from Hollis's other surviving negatives, it didn't match. Curiosity turned to disbelief when further comparison against later family records revealed something staggering. The print belonged to a living descendant of the Ellery family, a man named Michael Ellery residing in Bristol. It should have been impossible. The glass plate had been sealed for over a century, untouched since the late 19th century. No restoration technician, archivist or conservator had direct contact with it without gloves. Yet forensic analysis confirmed trace biological residue, a microscopic sweat deposit embedded deep within the gelatin layer. When DNA was extracted, degraded but readable, it yielded a partial genetic match to Michael Ellery's Y chromosome line. The probability of coincidence was less than 1 in 10 million. Scientists at first dismissed it as contamination, perhaps a modern fingerprint transferred unknowingly during the scanning process. But deeper layers told a different story. The residue wasn't on the surface of the plate. It was beneath the emulsion, locked within the chemical layers from 1889. That finding defied explanation. When contacted, Michael Ellery, age 42, was unaware his family portrait even existed. Yet during his interview, he revealed a haunting detail. For years, he had recurring dreams of a young boy blinking in a darkroom, over and over, as if trying to wake up. The statement chilled Dr. Helena Brooks. Though retired by then, she agreed to revisit her earlier research. Re-examining her notes, she noticed a pattern she had once dismissed as psychological drift. Each time she viewed the portrait, her notes described it differently. Sometimes the eyes appeared open, sometimes almost closed. Sometimes Thomas looked older. Other times, his gaze seemed to drift just off-center. She began to realize the photograph's subtle shift seemed tied to her own emotional state. On days of fatigue or grief, the boy looked solemn. On days of clarity, his eyes seemed almost alive. The observation prompted a new interdisciplinary study involving neuroscientists from King's College London. Their goal was to test whether the phenomenon was purely psychological, an instance of pareidolia, the human brain's innate tendency to find movement or emotion within static images. The experiment was simple. 30 volunteers, none familiar with the photograph, were shown a digitally identical scan of the Ellery portrait. While they observed, MRI scans tracked their neural activity. The results were unexpected. Across multiple subjects, distinct and synchronized activation occurred within the fusiform gyrus and superior temporal sulcus, regions associated with face recognition and movement detection. Even though the image remained perfectly static, viewers' brains responded as if it were moving. In other words, the human mind perceived and neurologically recorded motion where none existed. But the experiment did not end there. When the same subjects were re-exposed to the image weeks later, new patterns emerged. Neural scans revealed a kind of echo. Their brains recognized the photo as familiar memory before they consciously recalled seeing it. That finding fascinated Brooks. She recalled an obscure Victorian theory she had once dismissed, the idea that prolonged human observation leaves a residual imprint upon physical material. In the 19th century, early chemists noticed that oxidation on photographic surfaces increased with repeated handling or emotional attachment. Some spiritualists interpreted this as memory transfer, that emotion could chemically alter matter. Modern science had long rejected such notions. Yet the MRI results echoed that same principle in reverse. Instead of the photograph capturing life, it seemed to capture memory, each viewer contributing something of their own recognition, their own moment of seeing. To test this further, the York team conducted a chemical reanalysis of the Ellery plate under multispectral imaging. Over months of controlled exposure and rescanning, minute oxidation shifts appeared, not random but patterned, corresponding with the frequency of observation. Each scan subtly altered the light diffraction signature on the boy's eyes. Dr. Lang, reviewing the data, put it plainly: the plate behaves as though it's still developing. Each act of observation changes its chemistry, fraction by fraction, as if it remembers being seen. The emotional breakthrough came not from the scientists, but from Brooks herself. Watching the digital render, she felt, perhaps imagined, the smallest flicker in the boy's eyelids. The motion was imperceptible to measurement, yet undeniable in sensation. She wrote her final note in trembling handwriting. Perhaps Thomas never moved at all. Perhaps we do, and the image reflects that motion back. By the end of 2003, a consensus of sorts emerged. The Ellery portrait did not move on its own. It reacted, to light, to memory, to perception. It recorded somehow the subconscious blink of the observer, a physiological echo of attention, imprinted chemically across generations. The eerie paradox, however, could not be shaken. Thomas Ellery blinked only once in his short 12 years of life, yet every time another pair of eyes meets his across the century's glass, he blinks again. By 2009, the Ellery portrait had become a whispered fascination among collectors and academics alike. Most dismissed it as a technical curiosity, a century-old quirk of Victorian chemistry. But for Dr. Helena Brooks, it remained unfinished business, a question that lingered not in theory, but in memory. At 72, she returned to Whitby, the coastal town where the photograph had first been taken in 1889. The once bustling seaport had quieted, but traces of the past lingered. The same fog, the same salt-heavy air that must have hung over the photographer's studio more than a century before. Brooks wanted to find Edwin Hollis's original workspace, not to prove anything, but to stand where the first light had touched the plate. With the help of the local historical society, she located the foundation stones of Hollis's former darkroom behind an overgrown garden wall. The studio had long since collapsed, its beams charred by an old fire. Archaeologists clearing the site found small artifacts: glass fragments, rusted clamps, and an iron developing stand. Then, as they brushed aside a layer of compacted soil near the rear corner, a faint metallic glint appeared. It was a small tin case, rusted but intact. Inside were several undeveloped glass negatives, their emulsions sealed with wax, each wrapped in brittle tissue paper. The outermost bore Hollis's handwriting in fading ink: Ellery, November 1889. When the plates were transferred to a conservation lab for examination, one of them revealed something remarkable. After careful chemical stabilization, faint outlines emerged. The same family portrait, unmistakably the Ellerys. But this time Thomas's eyes were wide open, staring directly into the lens. His expression was almost identical to the known print. Same pose, same composition, yet the difference was unmistakable. Two photographs, taken within minutes of each other, one with eyes half closed, the other unblinking. Forensic spectrography confirmed both negatives had been produced on the same glass batch, likely within a single session. The chemical signatures indicated nearly identical environmental conditions: humidity, temperature, exposure time. The only logical explanation was that Hollis, in his pursuit of experimental technique, had attempted a dual exposure process. In the 1880s, photographers often used long exposures, 10, 15 seconds or more, during which even a small movement could produce ghostly overlaps. Hollis's notes mentioned his attempt to capture a moment between breaths, perhaps a poetic phrase for a prolonged capture sequence. The new discovery suggested something subtler. 2 consecutive moments fused into one memory, Thomas's eyelids fluttering open just as the exposure completed. To confirm, the lab digitally reconstructed the 2 images, layering them in perfect registration. When light intensity was adjusted, an optical illusion appeared. Thomas's face seemed to shift. Under dim light, his eyes drifted closed. Under brighter illumination, they appeared to open. It wasn't motion in the literal sense. It was light responding to 2 nearly identical chemical impressions. Yet even this explanation couldn't account for everything. When maiswometuninda, technicians examined the organic residue. The same fingerprint compound found years earlier appeared in both negatives, but not in the same position. The chemical analysis confirmed identical DNA traces in slightly different densities, implying not surface contamination, but multiple instances of contact during exposure. Somehow the residue recorded 2 distinct biological events decades apart, compressed into a single surface. Brooks noted in her field journal, "Perhaps the image is not 2 photographs, but 2 moments, one belonging to the boy, and one belonging to everyone who has ever seen him." It was a statement neither scientific nor spiritual, but somewhere between. In 2010, the newly discovered negatives and the digital composite were unveiled at a public exhibition in Leeds titled "Between Light and Stillness." Visitors entered a darkened gallery where the portrait was displayed under slow-changing illumination, alternating between warm and cool tones. As light shifted, viewers began to notice what Brooks had described: the faint suggestion of movement, the sense that the boy's expression reacted to them. Museum staff documented dozens of comments left in the visitor log. "He blinked," wrote one. "Only once. But I saw it. It's like he's waiting for you to look back," another said. Psychologists who attended the exhibition suggested perceptual projection. That expectation created motion. But even skeptics found the uniformity of the reports unsettling. Different viewers at different times, under different lighting conditions, and all describing the same experience. By then, Brooks had stopped trying to explain it. To her, the truth had shifted from chemistry to something more human. The portrait had never been about death or proof of the supernatural. It was about the smallest trace of life that endures, the hesitation between a blink and an exhale, preserved in glass. Before the exhibition closed, she supervised one final experiment. 2 plates, the half-closed and the open-eyed, were digitally combined into a single high-resolution frame. Under alternating wavelengths of light, Thomas's expression transitioned between them so gradually that the motion felt alive. Not an animation, not artifice, just the faint biological illusion of awareness. Brooks stood before the image that final evening as the lights dimmed, watching the faint shimmer of the boy's gaze. In her final recorded note, she wrote, "He is not haunting us. He is remembering." When the lights faded completely, the portrait settled back into stillness. For the public, the Ellery photograph had become something more than legend. Visitors described it as peaceful, sad, alive. But Brooks understood what few others could, that perhaps Hollis's experiment had succeeded, not in capturing motion, but in preserving the potential for motion, the eternal half-second between presence and memory, and in that suspended instant, across chemistry, time, and human perception. Thomas Ellery's blink had survived the centuries, not as a ghost, not as proof, but as a quiet reminder. Even the smallest movement can outlive us all. The 2010 exhibition was supposed to be a quiet tribute, a rediscovery of lost art. But when the lights dimmed and Boyle's photograph number 3 flickered ever so slightly, the room gasped. A blink, just once. Some said it was a trick of the projector. Others swore they saw the boy's eyes move. By the following morning, headlines around the world carried a new name for the century-old image: "The Boy Who Blinked." Online forums erupted. Paranormal investigators claimed proof of the supernatural, arguing that the camera had captured not a moment, but a presence. Photographers and chemists countered with theories of light refraction, silver halide decay, and chemical ghosting. Yet no experiment could fully replicate the blink. Every test came close, but not close enough. Dr. Brooks, exhausted by media interviews and skepticism, withdrew from public life. In her final lecture, she called the photograph a riddle of empathy, suggesting that perhaps machines too could hold emotion, if only as residue. It wasn't about ghosts, she said, but about memory refusing silence. The controversy birthed a new field of study. Academics began calling it technological haunting, the phenomenon where emotion and data intertwine so deeply that they distort perception itself. In journals, the Boyle image became a case study for how grief, nostalgia, and longing could warp even objective science. Was the boy's blink real? Or had viewers yearning for connection willed it into existence? The Royal Photographic Society intervened, removing the image from public display. It now rests in the image vault, sealed within controlled light and temperature conditions. Technicians monitor it periodically for visual drift, a faint warping of the emulsion that seems to shift the boy's pupils by microns over time. Whether illusion or transformation, they can't agree. Before retiring, Dr. Brooks submitted her notes to the archive, but one final entry remained unpublished, a cryptic reference to Plate 3B, a rumored hidden exposure Hollis might have created on the same day. If it exists, no one has found it. Yet whispers persist that the missing plate contained a mirror image, perhaps the boy's reflection, as though Hollis himself was questioning what truly looked back through the lens. Today, the legend endures not as proof of the paranormal, but as a meditation on human persistence. The boy in the photo may never have blinked. Maybe it was simply a trick of deterioration, or wishful eyes searching for life where none remained. But the effect lingers. Each generation rediscovers the image and feels the same chill, not from fear, but recognition. A reminder that even in stillness, something resists fading. Maybe that's what haunted Hollis, and what keeps us returning to the photograph. The quiet, impossible belief that moments once felt never truly disappear. That perhaps was never a ghost at all, just an ordinary boy refusing oblivion. Photography was never meant to conquer time, albeit only to witness it. Every image, no matter how still, trembles with the residue of what once lived before the lens. Boyle's photograph reminds us that pictures do not stop life. They echo it. Within every grain of silver lies the faint pulse of presence, not alive yet not entirely gone. The blink became more than a curiosity. It became a metaphor, a suggestion that memory itself moves, quietly, imperceptibly, even when framed in glass. Perhaps that's what unnerves us. Not the idea of ghosts, but the realization that the past still responds. Each time someone gazes at that photograph, searching for the truth of what they saw, the act of looking revives it. The boy endures not through science or superstition, but through attention, the fragile energy of remembrance. Maybe that's all photography ever promised, not permanence, but participation. A silent agreement between the living and the once lived, where each glance reawakens what time tried to erase. And in that space between belief and illusion, the story endures, soft as breath, endless as memory. Some say the boy blinked once. Others say he never stopped.